I'm Who's with Doom, and in this video, it's a discussion about the future of the Stormcast Eternals, kind of the potential for Stormhosts to have a dedicated line of models, and how Stormcast could shift the gaming meta. Alright, so a while back I made a video arguing that the rollout of the Stormcast Eternals mirrored that of the Space Marines in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, that both factions, apart from being aesthetically and narratively similar, are also being produced and fleshed out the same way. And I still agree with that argument. Time will tell. But I think we're still on track, and here's the reason why. Because Warhammer Fantasy and 40k have always been parallel mirrors of one another. And perhaps that argument is even stronger today than ever before. Right? A few of the fantasy races have dropped out in 40k pretty early on in the 90s, but there has never been a direct equivalent to Space Marines in Warhammer Fantasy until now, right? With the Stormcast Eternals. So certainly these similarities exist between these two, the Space Marines and the Stormcast. That's actually fairly obvious. They both have similar physical attributes, although they're kind of justified by different means. They have a similar narrative role. They're organized the same way into an organizational chart and pattern. And they both have kind of the strongholds or chapter monasteries. Now, perhaps the biggest difference is that Space Marines dominate the meta in 40k in a way that Stormcast simply do not in Age of Sigmar, at least currently. And this video is about how that could change. Now, to start, I'm going to rehash my argument from 2018 because you really need to understand that piece, I think, in order to really think about the development and the framework that is essential for understanding how the Stormcast could dominate the meta. Okay, so Age of Sigmar was launched in July 2016, and the game has been out for roughly 6 years. So when we compare the equivalent 6-year time frame period to 40k, beginning with the launch of Rogue Trader in 1987, we arrive at 1993. Now that's an important year in the development of 40k, because it's really in and after 1993 that you see individual Space Marine chapters gain an independent identity through their own unique codexes. Now these were principally the Ultramarines Codex, the Space Wolves, and the Angels of Death that would be later divided between the Blood Angels and Dark Angels. But time could prove me wrong, but my sense is that the role of the Stormcast Eternals is now in a similar position. I think we could see individual Stormhosts with their own potential battle tome and dedicated lines of models begin to come out with AOS 3.0. Now these might be fairly limited initially, just as there weren't complete lines of Space Marine models and Dark Angels and Space Wolves immediately in 40k, right? It takes a period of time to roll these out. It could be slow and purposeful, but I would be surprised if Games Workshop isn't interested in duplicating the commercial success and saturation of Space Marines in Age of Sigmar, right? To me, it's a level of success that Games Workshop would love to duplicate. And I could very well be that Age of Sigmar 3.0 is the right time to push Stormcast even further, just as they did with Space Marines in 1993. Now this kind of parallel 6-year period between 1987 and 1993 and 2015 and 2021 might seem a little funky, but it's really kind of potentially a proven precedent, right? It might be the right amount of time for consumers to adjust to an unfamiliar product. But gamers need to be emotionally and historically invested in the Stormcast Eternals as a concept before they can be further dissected. It seems like ancient history at this point, but the very notion and kind of aesthetic of the Stormcast was controversial in 2015, in a way that they simply are not now in 2021. When the game was launched, they did have a couple of accessory packs for a few of the different Stormhosts. I can't imagine those were a commercial success. Right? The concept was really too early. There's really no rules for different Stormhosts. And I just don't think that that was the right time to do it. Now let's look at the language to describe the Stormhost, because there are some common archetypes, let's say, in play here between the Space Marine chapters and the Stormcast Eternals. And again, really great opportunity for cross-pollination. If you like one in one army, I can see you enjoying the equivalent in the other. The Hammers of Sigmar are the golden ones, the first to the fray, Sigmar's champions, and their rules place emphasis on liberators and judicators, kind of rank and file units. And these, to me, this is kind of a Codex Stormhost equivalent for the Stormcast Eternals, right? They are the 40k equivalent of the Ultramarines. Then you have the Hallowed Knights, the Faithful, the Silver Saviors, the Soul Guardians. These are kind of described as very anti-chaos, very ferocious. And also, you could kind of talk about here the Celestial Vindicators, the Vengeful, the Hate-Filled, the Hurricane of Blades. And I think you could see kind of Black Templars being similar to both of these Stormhosts. I forget which one, but one actually prefers swords to hammers, and that would definitely, again, appeal to the Black Templar aesthetic. The Anvils of the Helden Hammer, the Ancients, they who claim death. They kind of remind me of the Legion of the Damned in 40k. The Knights Excelsior, the Holy Destroyers, the Whole Executioners, Annihilators all. And they have this emphasis on units of Paladins, which, you know, could be kind of like the AOS equivalent of Grey Knights. The Celestial Harbingers, right? The Seers of War and Masters of Portent, the Mystical Eye. They have an emphasis on the Sacrosanct Chambers. And this is a strange one, maybe more akin to the Thousand Suns. You know, which would be kind of an interesting narrative. And then you have the Tempest Lords, the hosts on high, the blue-blooded, the rulers above. They have an emphasis on the Angelos conclaves, and you know, to me, obviously, these are appealing to the same type of archetype as the Blood Angels. These kind of angelic, you know, armored hosts. And then the Astral Templars, kind of the Beast Slayers, Heaven's Claw, the Bane of Tyrants. They have an emphasis on Vanguard Chambers. Their armor is often covered in animal hides. And I think you can see parallels here with kind of Space Wolves. Now, there are others, right, in the same way that there are multiple different Space Marine chapters, but only a select few really get the attention, you know, and the emphasis on unique models. So I would focus mostly on these, you know, core Stormhosts. And my argument isn't that each of these all at the same time is going to be getting lines of models. I don't think that's realistic, but definitely 2 or 3, maybe. So now we're 6 years into the game. The current Stormcast Battalion has unique rules, unlike the first earlier iteration, for different Stormhosts. And I think that does follow kind of a general trend across every army in 40k and AOS. They almost all have some sort of sub-faction to a greater extent than ever before. You know, you can look at Iron Jaws, or Daughters of Cain, or Tyranids and Tau. They all have different sub-factions with kind of dedicated rules that allow you to kind of explore these things. But I would be shocked if many of these are provided individual lines of models, right? There simply isn't as much space for differentiation, nor are they comparable kind of flagship products to Space Marines and Stormcast Eternals. And we're now starting to see the Stormhosts be given greater depth and kind of narrative support For the first time, in the Broken Realms Morathi, we were introduced to Kaiser Van Brecht of the Anvils of the Heldenhammer, and recently kind of the first non-Hammers of Sigmar character model was unveiled as Gardas Steelsoul, Lord Selston of the Hallowed Knights. Now, I'm not arguing for anything that should be considered too controversial. More unique models will surely follow these examples, right? And the Stormhosts, at minimum, will always remain an avenue for further development. Now, Space Marines dominate the meta in 40k in a way that Stormcast simply do not. So how could the Stormcast change? Well, Games Workshop produces models first and rules second. If they flood the market with more Stormcast models and specific models for different Stormhosts in particular, which would allow very specific types of armies to be formed, right, the meta will naturally adapt. So in the early years of the hobby, right, my collection ambitions were limited to owning all of the supported Space Marine chapters, right, the Blood Angels, the Dark Angels, Black Templar, etc. Right, and those armies might seem a little generic, but there are real differences in gameplay, experience, and aesthetics there, right? And if Stormhosts are provided not just with a few unique rules, but also unique models, that would open up similar opportunities for collecting in gameplay, right? Right now, there's absolutely no point in owning 2 or 3 different Stormhosts. There's slight differences in rules, but not enough to really, anchor people to spend the amount of money required to develop 2 or 3 distinct armies. Now, Stormcasts do not dominate the meta, but they can change, and Games Workshop can engineer that change by releasing more models and more books for them. It's a pretty simple argument, right? Like, the Stormcast Eternals are a solid army in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and I've recently seen some community polling that would indicate more people own Stormcast Eternals than any other single army. The margins are not huge, right? But given the prevalence of Stormcast in army boxes, like the original Starter, Soul Wars, Blight War, etc., it's not surprising. I myself have, a decent-sized army of Stormcast, numbering a few thousand points, and I've only actively bought a few kits. It's like you can build this army passively, or purely by proxy. Now obviously, the same is true for Space Marines. You can't build an army of Ironjaws or Ideneth passively, any more than you can kind of Drukhari or Tau, right? You're almost pushed in this direction to constantly go towards the flagship. Now, for instance, the anticipated box set for 3.0 will likely have Stormcast Eternals arrayed against some other foe, right? In the same way that Space Marines have been included in every starter box for 40k, I think ever, right? And going forward, over a number of years, this situation could easily snowball as more and more box sets are produced that include the Stormcast Eternals. You're going to see more and more people have larger and larger collections of Stormcast. And I just point out, Warhammer Fantasy didn't have that dynamic, right? The Stormcast Eternals are new. When you think back to the old fantasy box sets, you had High Elves and Skaven, Dwarves and Night Goblins, Empires and Orcs, Bretonnians and Lizardmen. Right? There's no consistency there at all. They are not developing a flagship product army in quite the same way. So the use of the Stormcast Eternals here in these box sets is identical to that of Space Marines. Importantly, we know that there are many more Stormcast releases planned into the future already, even if they aren't Stormhosts. We have the Ruination Chamber, the Covenant Chamber, the Logister Chamber, and all have yet to be opened, right? And this is a potential new range of Stormcast models for each of these chambers. And it's frankly kind of years of releases right there. Not to mention, the potential of unique lines of models for Stormhosts. In the same way there are Dark Angels and Blood Angels in 40k. So in my efforts to catalog every Games Workshop model ever created, I quantified a kind of a simple truth, right? And that was that the number of Space Marine products produced by Games Workshop in Forge World amounts to roughly 40% of the entire Warhammer Fantasy and Age of Sigmar products combined, right? So all the fantasy models ever produced by Games Workshop, roughly 40% of that number is the equivalent of Space Marines in 40k. It's a massive amount. Now I'm still working through these numbers, but I think that ratio will pretty much remain consistent. There are a few models in Fantasy to add, and there are even more Space Marines to add going back through the years. And that number doesn't even include things like Chaos Space Marines and all their Horus Heresy support. Right, 40% represents only the Loyalists. It's crazy. So Space Marines dominate the meta in 40k because they saturate the gaming market. Individually, any one Space Marine chapter might not be the best in the meta, but collectively, one or more will always be a major consideration. Right? There are generic Space Marines, but there are also rules for Ultramarines, Imperial Fists, Raven Guard, Iron Hands, White Scars, and fully supported independent model lines for Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Space Wolves, Grey Knights, Death Watch, etc. Right? Now imagine a world where the 8 primary Stormhosts were given a similar treatment. 8 new armies are created slowly, perhaps at first, a few more rules, a few unique units for each, building over time to eventually have 5 or 6 fully unique ranges of models. That changes the meta dramatically. Now, to play devil's advocate, I will acknowledge one key difference between Space Marines and Stormcast in any meta. Space Marines have an average 3+ armor save, whereas Stormcast have an average of 4+. That's a huge difference, right? It's a seismic difference. A 3+, forces armies to always have enough punch to deal with the inevitable tide of 3+ armor. And when I first started to play 40k, you really did defeat your opponent by stacking as many AP2 and AP3 weapons in your army as possible, right? You don't take bolters, you don't take heavy bolters, you don't take flamers, you don't take things that can't punch through a 3+ armor. Rend is important in Age of Sigmar, but it would be far more important in a world where Stormcast, especially a great quantity of Stormcast, had a 3+ average save. Instead, if they have an average armor save that is common across many different armies, right? 4+ is not unusual in Age of Sigmar. It's kind of the standard armor save for most things. But imagine if the new Stormcast book in 3.0 were to make that change. And it's worth noting, actually, that the Stormkeep rules in Broken Realms Marathi already move Stormcast in that direction by providing a situational +1 to their armor save, effectively making them a 3+. I don't know if that will be the case. Mind blown, I guess, if they make a 3+, a more of a standard armor save for Stormcast. But it does change things. It does make them not quite like Space Marines. And I wonder if that was, maybe in hindsight, a mistake on their part. Or if it just makes the game a little more balanced. I don't know. Only time will tell if I'm right about these Stormhosts. I think, given a long enough trajectory, I think I'll be right. It's just whether or not it will happen this year. If it happens this year, then it seems to me that they are playing off directly the 40K playbook, using roughly the same type of time scale. And it makes sense that they would look back at kind of a time-proven example of what worked. So what do you think? Am I crazy here? Will we see independent lines of Stormhosts and many more Stormcasts on the table going forward? I'll see you in the next video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Please consider supporting the channel by commenting on the video, hitting that little like button, and subscribing for more Warhammer content.